Snow clung to the soldier's face as he trudged through the frozen fields of Pomerania, January 17, 1940. The biting wind cut through the thin wartime uniform, a cruel reminder of the harsh winter that gripped the German heartland. His breaths came in slow, measured puffs, each one curling into the air like the faint promise of life in an uncertain world. Around him, the landscape was hushed, a vast expanse of white stretching toward a sky that refused to give way to daylight. This was not the land he had been promised. The war had already begun to steal from him. In the distance, the soldiers spotted a flicker of movement. A small group of his fellow soldiers huddled around a modest fire, their silence speaking to the exhaustion that had settled into their bones. He knew the routine by now. Each day began with the same expectation, the same hope that victory was just one battle away. The propaganda told them they were the chosen few, the heralds of a new order, and for a time, they had believed. But now, as the winter deepened and the rations thinned, the belief was fraying like old cloth under relentless pressure. Yet, in moments like these, when the cold forced them into stillness, something flickered in his mind, a distant, almost forgotten memory of warmth. That morning, the day he had received the first glimpse of something different, a soldier's voice had spoken of a meal unlike any they had known. A soup, rich and foreign, carried on tins that gleamed under the dim light of a makeshift kitchen. It had not been a feast, but the mere idea of it had stirred something in him. For a split second, the bitter wind had not mattered, the hunger had not been all-consuming. In that moment, he had believed that perhaps, just perhaps, the war could bring something other than deprivation. Yet, as he approached the fire now, the distant memory faded under the weight of the present. The men around him spoke in quiet tones, not of triumph, but of dwindling supplies, of roads that had yet to be repaired, of promises that had yet to be fulfilled. The soldier sat, wrapped in his coat, and held his hands close to the meager flame. He did not know what the future held, but he knew that whatever came next, this cold, this silence, would shape it. By January 1940, Germany's war campaign was unraveling. At the outset, the Wehrmacht had swept through Poland in a matter of weeks, a feat that had stunned the world and emboldened the Reich. The propaganda machine had fed the populace with images of conquest, of a nation on the rise, of an army that had already secured its place in history. Yet, as the calendar turned, the truth of the war's toll became undeniable. The initial momentum had come at a cost. Men, resources, and morale all began to wane as the reality of prolonged warfare set in. The war effort, once an intoxicating promise of power and prestige, now carried an undercurrent of quiet desperation. Germany had entered the conflict with confidence, but it had not done so with limitless resources. The Reich's economy, dependent on strategic reserves and tightly controlled imports, could not sustain a war of attrition at the scale of a world conflict. Food supplies dwindled, rations were cut, and the population, once eager for war, now found itself gripped by hardship. The soldier who trudged through the snow was not alone in his suffering. Millions of Germans had already begun to feel the war's weight in their stomachs, their homes, and their hearts. The original expectations of the German people had been shaped by a vision of swift victory. They had been taught to believe that the war would be short, that Germany's might would be enough to secure their place in the world. But the front lines had not yet reached France, and already, the Reich stood on the brink of supply lines stretched thin. Infrastructure crumbled under the strain of military demands, and the propaganda machine, once so confident, now struggled to reconcile its grand vision with the harsh reality of rationing and shortages. For soldiers like the one in Pomerania, the early months of the war had been a test of endurance. They had trained for battle, but not for the slow, creeping exhaustion that winter and war brought. The expectation had been one of strength and triumph, yet what they had found was a war that gnawed at their resolve, one frozen field at a time. The soldier had never been hungry like this before. He had fought for rations in the trenches, had seen comrades suffer from empty bellies, but this was a different kind of hunger. It gnawed at his thoughts, not just in his stomach, but in every part of him. He had been told that the war was a temporary struggle, that Germany would emerge stronger, and yet, the longer the conflict dragged on, the more he saw that the reality did not align with the promises. The Reich had assured them that victory would bring plenty, but here, on the fringes of a frozen war, there was only scarcity and the slow erosion of hope. Then came the soup. It arrived in a tin, unmarked save for the strange American insignia that caught the dim light of the fire. The soldier's breath caught as he stared at it. This was not the thin gruel of his homeland, nor the bitter broth that barely passed for sustenance. He had never seen anything like it. When the first spoonful touched his tongue, it was unlike anything he had known before. Warmth spread through him, not just from the heat of the food, but from the unfamiliar flavors, herbs he could not name, the richness of something beyond what his homeland could provide. It was not just nourishment, it was a promise of something more. He did not yet understand the full weight of what he was experiencing. He only knew that for the first time in months, he was not merely surviving. He was tasting something different, something that did not belong to the war. And then he thought of his mother, of the kitchen at home, of the moments before the war when meals had been hearty, when bread had not been rationed, when food had not been a battlefield. But as the soup settled in his chest, he realized something had shifted. The war had not promised this. The Reich had not brought this. It had come from another place, one far beyond the reach of propaganda and ideology. And it was not just the soldier who wept in that moment. A woman, seated nearby, had been serving the soup quietly, watching the men take their first taste. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed the tin into another soldier's grasp, and as the warmth touched his lips, she let out a deep, shuddering breath. In that instant, for her, it was not merely food. It was the first real gift of the war, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there remained something human, something undeniable. The soldier would later recall that moment as the first crack in the edifice of his belief. Until then, he had clung to the narratives the Reich had fed him, of a nation on the cusp of greatness, of a people destined to rise above the weakness of the West. He had never doubted the promise of victory, even in the face of hardship. But the taste of the American soup, the rich warmth that had not come from the Reich's kitchens, had stirred something in him that could not be ignored. It was not just nourishment. It was proof that the world Germany had entered was not as black and white as the propaganda had claimed. In the months preceding this moment, the war had already begun to erode the stability of the Reich's economic and societal foundations. The Nazi government had made grand assurances, promises of self-sufficiency through the 4-year plan, of industrial might that would outpace the Allies. But by the winter of 1940, these assurances had begun to unravel. The Reich's food production, once expected to support itself, had faltered. The blackening of the food lines, the strict rationing of essentials, and the growing scarcity of imported goods were no longer hidden from the public. What had once been a nation of plenty was slowly turning into one of deprivation. The soldier himself had seen the signs. In the autumn of 1939, when the war first began, the rations had still been adequate, even generous. The government had declared victory was imminent, and with it came the belief that abundance would soon return. But as the months stretched on, the rations grew smaller, the queues longer, the complaints more frequent. The once healthy population now bore the signs of hunger, emaciated limbs, hollow eyes, a quiet desperation that had seeped into their daily existence. The soldier had seen it in his own people, mothers giving up their portions to their children, the elderly disappearing into the cold with no one to care for them, the once proud cities now littered with the remnants of a war turning against them. And yet, he had still believed in the Reich's promise. He had told himself that the hardships were temporary, that Germany was on the brink of securing the glory that had eluded it for so long. He had believed that the war would be over soon, that the Reich would reclaim what had been lost, that the world would see the strength of their cause. But the American soup had not come from the Reich's kitchen. It had come from a foreign land, one that the government had painted as decadent, as weak, as a people who had no concept of strength or sacrifice. Yet, their food was rich, their supplies unbroken. The soldier had not yet understood the full weight of what it meant, but in the depths of that moment, he felt a shift, a realization that the enemy was not merely an idea, not just a propaganda enemy, but a people with the means to provide, to sustain, to endure. The soldier would not be the only one to see it. Others in the Reich had begun to ask the same questions, to notice the same gaps in the narratives they had once accepted without question. The Wehrmacht's own records detailed the growing strain on the Reich's food reserves. In December 1939, the siege of Danzig had stretched the Wehrmacht's supplies to their limits, forcing the army to rely on dwindling food stocks. The Berlin newspapers had reported the first signs of rationing, warning of the need for sacrifice and unity. Yet even as the government urged the people to endure, the reality of the Reich's economic fragility only deepened. And in that moment, the soldier could not escape the truth. The war was not bringing abundance. It was not bringing the victory the Reich had promised. The Reich had promised strength. The American soup had given him warmth. It was not just a meal. It was an echo of something the Reich could not provide. As the cold winter deepened and the war's burdens grew heavier, the soldier found himself returning to that first taste of the American soup, not just as a memory of warmth, but as a symbol of something far greater. The Reich had painted the enemy as a decadent, weakened people, a false utopia built on the backs of a dying empire. Yet the soldier had seen with his own eyes that their soup was not just food. It was proof of something undeniable. The enemy had not only the resources to feed their people, but the means to do so with care, with abundance. Where the Reich had promised strength through sacrifice, the enemy had provided comfort through unity. The soldier was not alone in his realization. Among his fellow soldiers, the question of who truly held the power of sustenance had begun to take root. The war had not been a mere war of ideology, but of supply lines, of economies that dictated survival. The Reich had spoken of victory, yet its own people were starving. The enemy had spoken of democracy, yet their people could still sit at the table and eat. In the soldier's mind, the war had begun as a battle of ideas, a clash of destiny between two opposing worldviews. But now, the lines had blurred. The soldier had been trained to believe that the enemy was a force to be conquered, but the American soup had shown him that they were also a people capable of providing. The soldier had once carried the Reich's propaganda in his mind, the belief that this war was just. He had been told that Germany was righting the wrongs of history, that the Reich was building a new order in which the strong would rise. He had believed in that vision, had shared the dream of a world led by German strength. But the American soup had disrupted that belief. It was not just food. It was a statement, a quiet yet undeniable truth that the enemy did not need to build an empire to provide for its people. Their strength lay not in conquest, but in their ability to sustain. As the soldier and his fellow soldiers moved from the battlefield to the front lines, the war continued to wear on them, yet the taste of that first American soup lingered in their minds. It had not been a grand revelation, but something small, something that had taken root in the quiet spaces between rations and hardship. They had been raised to see the enemy as the enemy alone, a people to be vanquished. But now they saw something else. They saw a people with the means to provide, to survive, to endure. They had not felt the weight of the Reich's war effort on their shoulders in the same way. They had not had to ration their food, to watch their rations dwindle into nothingness. They had had something Germany could not match, not strength in battle, but strength in sustenance. And in that realization, the soldier understood the war in a new way. The Reich had been selling a vision of strength through suffering, of victory built upon sacrifice. But now, he saw that the enemy was not defeated by hunger, by want, by the ravages of war. They had something else, an abundance that could not be taken away. And as he watched other soldiers taste the soup, as he saw them too remember the taste, he saw that the tide of war was no longer just one of armies and weapons, but of ideology and belief. The Reich had promised a world where strength reigned. But the American soup had shown them another future, one where strength was not measured in conquest, but in the ability to endure. It was an idea the Reich could not afford to suppress. The soldier did not yet know if this moment would change the course of the war, but he knew that he was not the same man who had once marched through the snow with only a cold meal in his mind. The first American soup had done more than fill an empty stomach. It had cracked open the foundation of the Reich's promise. And in the quiet of the soldier's heart, he felt the first stirrings of something new. Not just uncertainty, but the beginnings of a truth that would shape the rest of the war to come. The soldier had not been raised to understand the power of food. In the Reich, meals had always been a matter of necessity, of survival. The propaganda had spoken of abundance, of a time when the German people would once again be masters of their own destiny. But the reality had been different from the promise. The soldier had spent his childhood watching the remnants of pre-war Germany, the memories of hearty meals and full tables fading as the war tightened its grip. Now, the Reich's food lines had grown thinner, the rations more meager, and the hunger more persistent. Yet here in the frozen fields of Pomerania, he had tasted something else. American soup had not been a feast, not in the grand sense of the Reich's pre-war banquets, but to the soldier, it had been something else entirely. It had been warmth, comfort, and something closer to the fullness he had once known. It had not been just an act of war, of sending supplies to the front lines. It had been a symbol of abundance, of a people who had the means to provide, to sustain, to endure. And in the soldier's mind, it had become something more. It had become proof. Proof that the Reich's promise had been hollow. Proof that the idea of strength through suffering, of conquest through sacrifice, was not the only path. In the quiet of the moment, the soldier had understood something that the Reich's propaganda had never allowed him to see. The enemy was not a people of weakness. They were not the decadent, dying civilization the Reich had painted them to be. They were a people who had the means to provide for their soldiers, to give them warmth when it was most needed. They were a people who had built their strength not through the conquest of others, but through the ability to sustain their own. The soldier had been trained to see this war as a battle of ideologies, of Germany versus the West. But now he saw that the real battle was something else. It was the battle of which strength would endure, which vision of the future would shape the world. The soldier had not yet spoken of it, had not yet dared to question the Reich's promises. But in the quiet of his mind, the soup had planted a seed. It had shown him that the war was not just about victory or defeat, but about the future. The Reich had promised a new order, one built upon strength and sacrifice. But the American soup had shown that there was another path, a path that did not require the suffering of the people to build its strength, a path that did not rely on war to sustain itself, a path built on the simple, yet powerful truth of abundance. As the soldier walked away from the fire, the taste of the soup still lingering on his tongue, he carried with him something the Reich had not wanted him to understand. The soup was not just food. It was a symbol of a world where strength did not come from the barrel of a gun, but from the table of a shared meal, where power did not rely on the conquest of others, but on the ability to provide for one's own. In the soldier's heart, the soup had become more than just sustenance. It had become the taste of democracy, of a people who had chosen a different way. And for the first time, he was not sure the Reich was the right path to the future he had once believed in. The soldier had long believed that the war would be decided on the battlefield, that the Reich's triumph would be defined by the fall of its enemies. But in the days that followed, as he walked among his fellow soldiers, he saw that something else was shaping the course of the war. It was not just the weapons, not just the strategies, but the very idea of what it meant to be a people. The Reich had spent years proclaiming its strength, its invincibility, its destiny. But now, the soldiers saw a truth that could not be ignored. A people did not merely conquer through force. They endured through something far greater than war machines and propaganda. They endured through the ability to sustain themselves, to nourish not just their bodies, but their very sense of purpose. The American soup had not been sent as a grand declaration of war. It had been a quiet, almost unnoticed act. Yet it had spoken louder than any speech, any battle cry. It had shown the Reich's people something they had not yet been allowed to see, that strength was not merely in the willingness to suffer, but in the ability to rise above it. The soldier had been told that the Reich was building a new order, one that would endure for centuries. But the soup had shown him that the enemy had something else. Not just armies, not just factories, but a different kind of power, the power of abundance. The power to provide for their people even in the face of war. And it was not just the soldier who had begun to see this truth. Across the Reich, people were beginning to ask the same question: what kind of world was worth fighting for? The propaganda had promised a future of strength and glory, but the reality was that the war had already begun to consume the very people who had been told it was their salvation. The soldier had seen it in the empty market stalls, in the thinning rations, in the tired eyes of soldiers who had been promised glory but found only want. The Reich had taught them that strength came from sacrifice. But now, the soldier was beginning to wonder if the true power of a people lay not in their willingness to suffer, but in their ability to sustain one another. The soldier had once believed that food alone could not decide the fate of a war. But now, he had tasted a truth that could not be denied. The Reich had fought for scarcity, for the promise of a world built upon conquest. The enemy had fought with the knowledge that their strength came not from the barrel of a gun, but from the table of a shared meal. And as the soldier lingered in the quiet of his thoughts, he understood that the war would be remembered not just for its battles, but for the silent yet undeniable proof that the Reich had been wrong. Freedom was not found in the destruction of others. It was found in the ability to sustain, to build, to provide for those who had once believed in victory. And so, the soldier walked forward, no longer as the man who had first tasted the American soup in the frozen fields of Pomerania. He had not yet spoken of it, had not yet shared the truth he had uncovered. But as he walked, the warmth of that moment remained with him. The soup had not been just food. It had been a quiet revelation, a reminder that the true strength of a people was not measured in what they took, but in what they gave. And in that moment, the soldier understood that the war was no longer just a battle for victory. It was a battle for the soul of the world that would emerge from its ashes. The soldier walked alone now, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the snow. The fire had long since faded into embers, the other soldiers having dispersed, returning to their weary routines. The cold pressed against him, but it was not the unbearable cold of early morning. The warmth of the soup still lingered in his chest, a quiet ember against the bitter night. It was not just the taste that remained, it was the memory of what it had meant. A moment of sustenance, yet it had become something more. A symbol, a truth hidden in the simplest of gestures. He did not know what the future held. The war was far from over, its course still uncertain. The Reich would continue its struggle, its propaganda echoing in the minds of those unwilling to question. But for the soldier, the path had shifted ever so slightly. The soup had not been an act of war, not in the way the enemy had been told. It had not been a declaration of conquest, nor a sign of weakness. It had been something else entirely, a quiet offering, a single, unassuming gift that had cracked open the foundation of everything the Reich had built upon. As he reached the edge of the encampment, the soldier cast one last glance back at the fire's remnants. Somewhere, An American soldier had once stirred that soup, unaware of the effect it had stirred in another man across enemy lines. The soup had crossed more than a battlefield. It had crossed the divide of ideologies, of expectations, of the very notion of what war could mean. The Reich had told its people that victory came through strength, through the might of their arms. But in the soldier's mind, this war was becoming something far more complex. It was not just a war for land, for power, for dominion. It was a war for a way of life, for the future of a world that had yet to be shaped. And in that moment, as the soldier turned away into the cold, he understood that the true battle was not just fought with weapons. It had always been fought with food, with shelter, with the ability to provide for one's own. The Reich had built its vision upon the promise of sacrifice. But the soldier carried with him a different promise now, an unspoken yet undeniable truth that had settled in his bones. The war would not be remembered for its battles alone. It would be remembered for the moments of humanity that had endured against the tide of war, for the fragile yet unbreakable link between people who had once been enemies, now bound by the simplest of things. A meal, a taste, a truth that had found its way into the quiet hearts of those who had once believed in victory.